All right, hi everybody. This is the package management subproject meeting. It's kind of our kickoff. It's March 16th. All right, so let's get going. I will start by displaying the agenda. Okay. All right, so just to start off with some logistics. So I just picked this time without consulting anybody. So I'm happy to discuss making it a different time, but just wanted to raise that if there's any major concerns. It might be better to do it, raise it in Slack or something. The other thing I wanted to ask folks is, do we think, Wim is doing, I think Wim's here, is doing a bunch of bootstrapping meetings on package specialization subproject. I'm happy to do the same thing here. I'm curious whether, I don't know, probably we should to get things going faster, but the calendar's crowded. So I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts on that before we get going.
So the timing is fine for me, at least. It works well, and the bootstrap meetings would be very useful if we could have them.
Okay, all right. So I'll take a look at the calendar. I'll try and set some things up, yeah, and then we'll record them. And no, Wim, or I'm sorry, Tal is doing a 2-hour call today, which he's going to record, and I think he's also going to do. He's hoping at some point to do an India-friendly time. It's going to go over Porch and Kept, which are. So I think that would be super useful for people in this subproject as well to observe or participate in. I'm only going to make it for part of that, but at least I want to get a flavor for exactly what he's saying, because I haven't really had a preview of it. But I think that's going to be super helpful. But yeah, I will then next week. I'll look at my calendar and I'll try and set up some times for next week for bootstrapping, and then we'll record them and we'll go from there. All right. Awesome. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about. Let me find my agenda again. The scope of this subproject. So the details are there in that link, and just for people's. Let me put this in the chat. There's the agenda if anybody wants to see it. So what the scope comes down to it's kind of the entry point to the entire process. So how do you initiate the deployment and the management, really, because it's declarative, of your things that are under NAFIO management, your applications, your network functions, and how do I think the way we described it in that scope in the document was sort of everything before fan out, so and including fan out. So what that means is that we get some packet of intent from the customer, the user, that says, I want to deploy this application, which might be complex and have components in different tiers of our physical or our cluster topology. How do I specify that intent, and how do I then get to the point where the individual packages for deployment on individual clusters are sort of prepped as much as we can prep them without the package specialization team's work kicking in. So this how do we get through to the fan out? So there's a couple of pieces of that. In the workshop, we demonstrated something we call the 5G core topology controller. Now, in our sort of discussions we've all had since, the CRDs are a little bit different than they were in the workshop, and they're a little more decomposed, so that like we don't necessarily need a topology controller. That role, we may want to build one, and we can discuss that in this project as we go further along. But that role may be served by a higher level orchestrator, or maybe served by simply having a team of people get together and sort of make decisions about what an architecture looks like, and then capturing it in a package. So if we have time today, I'm going to go through a kind of sample of what I mean by that, what that looks like, and kind of the goals as I see it for this sub-project. So that's that first bullet. When we go, and interrupt me if I'm not making any sense, by the way, I'm happy to answer questions. One of if you look at the second bullet, one of the primitives, and the way we're doing that, what I just described, is by having certain Kubernetes resources that are used to describe how to take the sort of generic upstream package and tell Nefio which clusters to distribute that package to, and how to customize that package for each of those clusters. So that's what that second piece is. So that's a very generic kind of configuration management functionality. We built in the workshop, if you've gone through the workshop pieces, and again, I'll do bootstrapping, I guess, next week, and we maybe can go through some of that in detail. But we built something called the package deployment controller, and it served this role of and then we used that as a prototype for informing what we would build into the upstream Porch project to satisfy those same use cases that don't tie directly to a Nefio CRD, which the package deployment controller does. So that's what package variant and package variant set do. Package variant set describes the fan out, and package variant manages individual instances of that fan out and in repositories. And Tal will get into all of that in quite a bit of detail later today. And so based on what he does, I'll kind of tailor the bootstrapping things next week. But I also, after that session, would love for folks to come back with questions. Like, I'd love to tailor the discussion next week to, further answering people's questions on those things as well. So that's the first two bullets. Topology controllers, high level intent controllers. Like I said, those likely we may be able to get away without actually building code for those. We may want to build code to demonstrate from how an orchestrator might utilize some of these primitives. The third one here, cross-package dependencies. So the idea here is that sometimes if I want to deploy a package, I have dependencies that need to be met first. So some of those dependencies may be satisfied by deploying a different package. So the simplest example, two very readily available examples. I want to deploy a package that contains a CR. The CRD needs to have been deployed to the cluster first, so that may be in a different package. So for example, if you were trying to deploy something that used the cert manager CRs, you would have had to have the cert manager itself package deployed to the cluster first. Sometimes those other packages are, it's a different team. that has the authority to deploy those. So the second one, before I get to the hand, second readily available example of cross-package dependencies would be namespace. So often the people who deploy an application are not the same people who can provision a namespace. And so your namespace provisioning might happen in a different package and with a different set of approvals needed. And so we would like to be able to identify those and automatically suggest or raise those if possible. Whether we do this in R1 or not is still unclear. There's a hand, Jean-Marie. You're muted still.
Oh, sorry. Is it a package dependency or is it a resource dependency? And the mechanism that we need is a way to express dependencies on other Kubernetes resources, and the fact that those resources are in which package doesn't matter.
You're absolutely right. So the idea, I should have linked the issue where we discussed this. I think there might even be comments. Well, the idea is exactly what you said. Like the package should express the resource dependency, and by resource here I mean, well, it's not even. It can actually be conceptual, right? I need a database. And here's a set of criteria. I'm trying to deploy a blog application. Now, this obviously has nothing to do with Nephi or network functions per se, but you can see the analogies. I'm going to deploy a blog. I need a database. The blogging app supports, Postgres and MySQL. So I need satisfied in my, before I can deploy, I need a condition satisfied that says that the database exists and I know how to talk to it. I've got an endpoint to talk to it and a credential to talk to it. And that could be satisfied. That could be manually satisfied by a user going and instantiating that. That can be satisfied by deploying a package that runs a database in a cluster. That could be satisfied by deploying a package that provisions a cloud-based service with that. It can be resolved in many different ways. And I want the infrastructure we design, and like I said, I don't know if this will happen in R1. I want the infrastructure we design to be able to support that. Now, you run into all kinds of other questions. How do you make a decision between which ways to satisfy it? Is it a human decision? Is it an automated decision? So great point. And yes, so it's not really the only reason. The differentiating reason says cross-package is to differentiate between dependencies between resources in the same package, which we can handle at apply time. So if you've got a package that's got a namespace and a namespace resource that belongs in that namespace, you have to create the namespace first. And that's, yeah. John?
I don't think we should think in terms of temporal dependencies, because we're in a cloud or in Kubernetes. Kubernetes can reclaim resources anytime. So we need to think, we need to stop thinking about, I need to do this before that.
You're right. Yeah. It should be. So I'll show you an example of so there's different ways to resolve that we might be. Yes, I totally agree. There's only a few things that are hard dependencies that are actually temporal, like you have to create the namespace before you add resources. You have to create the cluster before you can put workloads on it. But most things don't have a specific ordering and shouldn't have a specific ordering. So, but that all of that discussion is in the scope of this sub-project. And we can solve those problems either in Nefio, or we can solve them if we want to upstream in Porch, or we can we'll have to make that decision as we go. And then the last piece that's in the scope is the Nefio UI. So what we have today in the workshop is a sort of a lightly customized version of another UI that's for Porch, but it's really a prototype. All of it's prototype. And so the question will be probably post R1, what do we want for the UI? And it's basically a blank slate. For R1, unless, I got half a dozen volunteers that are super willing and excited and know UIs inside and out, I can't imagine we'll be able to do anything more than a few tweaks to the existing UI, but again, I'm open to that. So those are the kind of the broad areas of scope for this sub-project. So are there any questions on that? Okay. So the next thing, if you look in the agenda document, as I've put a section here, contribution areas. So what I would ask folks to do is I tried to summarize those different areas of scope. And the reason this, by the way, says Go and Kubernetes controllers for the actual writing of code, that would likely be a controller, a dependency controller that identifies the dependencies by looking at the resources. But there's a lot of sort of work to do to do that. And like I said, we may not need that in R1. But in any case, I tried to define the skills needed. And I put my name on all of them. But if you could go in and put your name in on what areas you think you can contribute to and in what way, that would be super helpful. This is not a commitment at this point. The idea is to get an idea, is to get a sense of what capacity we have as we move forward. That'll help us make sort of decisions on what we can actually deliver in R1. Okay. All right then. So given that, if there's no further questions on that, what I'd like to do is show a little example, and maybe this is premature because I didn't do the bootstrapping sessions, but I want to go. That's what I've got prepared in any case, so hopefully it will be useful. Yeah, Jean-Marie.
Yeah. Yes. Before we leave that kind of logistical questions, may I ask that the GitHub repos that we will be using be set up as soon as possible?
Yeah.
Because I'm probably not the only company having this type of processes, but we need to go through a bit of a process to be able to contribute to a particular repo, and the sooner we can get that done, the more efficient we will be.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just take a note here. I don't know how. There's some special thing that I think we can. All right. I don't know how to do it. Whatever. So AI. Create repos ASAP. Okay. All right, sounds good. So that said, maybe first thing, I'll refresh people's memory a little bit on the sort of flow that we have in Nephio. If you recall, in the, let's see how big I can make that. Is that readable?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me see if I have the diagram I'm looking for before I. Actually, I don't see the diagram I'm looking for, but this one serves more or less the same thing. It's just very tiny. Okay, so just to remind you of the sort of flow that an individual package under deployment goes through. We can ignore kind of all this stuff to the left. This is like, well, I guess we won't. We'll talk about like, right, we have different constituencies. As I said, this sub-project is kind of the front door. And so it starts all the way at the left-hand side of this. And there should actually be multiple flows here. This isn't the best diagram. One flow is the authoring of a vendor package. So a vendor like a Nokia or an Ericsson or a Free 5GC authors start by creating a package that says, here's the recommended way in which you deploy our particular application. Maybe it's geared towards a particular use case, like, okay, this is the architecture you use for this function when you have, a relatively small installation. Here's a different architecture you use for a very large one, but regardless, they're all just captured in these packages. And then that's put in some sort of catalog, whether it's public or it's only shared with the customers, whatever, it doesn't matter. The internal at the telco organizational team, design team or architecture team, I'm not sure exactly the right terminology, they will potentially take that package, bring it into their organization. So this is what I call the private catalog. So this is this operation from the public catalog to the private catalog. And they'll make changes to it to customize it for their particular environment. They may add policies, they may specify certain values that are global across their organization for some reason, or global across the intended uses of this particular package. And eventually they'll go through an approval process amongst themselves, and they'll publish that in their private catalog. At that point, it's sort of ready for consumption by for deployment purposes. This flow is showing sort of a single, if you were deploying one at a time, and there's no fan out. So essentially, everything this sub-project does is kind of in this one clone operation, but we're going to automate all of that across a fleet, and that's kind of the idea. So you take that package for a particular purpose, you clone it, you customize it further with humans or with controllers. The controllers here are what these are the controllers that WIM's sub-project for package specialization are doing. So these are, I've got a package that I'm preparing for deployment to a specific cluster. There's additional customizations I want to automate on top of that. And then eventually it flows through, it gets committed and approved. And then this is where the third sub-project takes over, which is the workload cluster, is all of this stuff down here. Does that at a very, very high level, does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay, so so what I've done as a sort of example, what we did, or rather what we did in the workshop cluster is right here. At this line, I assume you can see my mouse. We created the 5G core topology controller, and then it created package deployments, and package deployments essentially made this single clone operation shown in this single package workflow. It multiplexed it, fanned it out so that it was doing it a dozen times. Well, I think we did it 3 times or something, 3 or 4 times, right? We had 3 or 4 different clusters we were destined for. So that's that automation, and what happens there is what we're going to focus on. So in that context, I have created a few packages to show how I think that we can use the package variant set directly and compose it into its own package with other package variant set to replace the deployment controller. Yeah. Is there a question? Okay, to replace the topology controller. So I don't have a running workshop VM right now, but in the workshop, the 5G core topology did a couple of things. It did the targeting and said, okay, you want to deploy this to several different clusters. Or actually, rather, what it did is it created a package deployment resource, which is equivalent to a package variant set resource. And the idea was it could create multiple of those, one for UPF, one for SMF, one for AMF. We only demonstrated it with the one for UPF. Similarly, rather than using a controller to do that, we can just manually package that in a cluster. So what I've done in this right here, very, very simple. There's actually only two resources defined in here. One is a package variant set for edge and a package variant set for regional. So what the context is here, I'm not a network function expert, but I know quite a bit about DNS. And so I'm using that as an example application. And the architecture, I'm putting myself in the position of the DNS team at some organization, and I'm like, okay, we're going to be setting up, a few hundred edge clusters across a dozen regions, and so I need, and I'm going to need DNS there. What I want for my DNS architecture is just caching DNS, so it's not authoritative, which means it's just like lookups. I want each edge cluster. I don't have a lot of resources on those, so I want each edge cluster to have a small cache, and maybe only use up one CPU or something. Keep it relatively small there, or a couple replicas maximum. And I don't want those talking directly to the internet. So I'm going to put in my regional clusters a larger cache that then has upstream connectivity to the internet. And so I have a two-tier caching architecture here with sort of leaf nodes at the edge that are small and a bigger core DNS, or bigger DNS cache instance per regional cluster. So that's the scenario. Does that, any questions on that before I continue? Okay, so then the idea is how do I use Nefio to deploy all of that as a single application? And what I did, I guess first I need those packages that define each of those. So I have a package that defines what an edge DNS instance looks like. And I have a package that defines what a distribution layer or regional DNS application looks like. And then I need something that describes how to deploy each of those and where to deploy them. And eventually, it's not done yet, but eventually how to glue them together. And so that's what this is. So this package all by itself kind of takes the place of what we did in the workshop of the core topology controller, just by having the two package variant sets in YAMLs here. So actually I have this, I can put this in, oh man, that's not, I have another, I have a UI for it, but it's unfortunately on my other machine, which is not easy to display from here. All right, so let's take a look at what these look like. Let me see if I can get this to display here. Let me just minimize that. I'm going to change the window I'm displaying 1 second. Okay. So can you see my other screen now? You're seeing the Nephew UI such that it is. Okay, thank you. So what I did here is I'm sorry. I also need to show you so these are all the different clusters I set up. And I'll get into how we can do this with our like we don't need to set up a whole Nephew environment. We actually so one of the things about doing work in this subproject is if you're only doing work in this subproject, you actually don't even need edge clusters. All you need is one cluster, and then you can just create repos, and we don't have to worry about, we only have to get that far. So it can be a little bit simpler development environment. But what in any case, what I've set up are a bunch of simulated. There's no actual clusters behind these, but you can see I've got like US Central 1 regional cluster, US Central 2 regional cluster, US Central 1 edge clusters, US East 1 edge clusters. And I actually have 2 US East 1 regional clusters because, of course, you might have more than 1 regional clusters in a given region, and that has an impact on how the configuration of the individual application happens. So that's kind of the setup that I did, and the links are in the agenda document for the YAML files for this. But and then I went ahead and deployed the topology document. So it's super simple. If you look at them, hopefully that's legible. They define a package variant set. So this is now a reference to a package. So we have those coordinates distribution, or caching DNS distribution, caching DNS edge packages. So this is another package. It's kind of a little bit meta, but this is another package that then contains references to those packages. So this is saying, I want to distribute, I want to take this package, caching DNS distribution, revision 3, and I want to install it on all the repositories who have a label nephew org site type regional. Then similarly, I have a second one, the edge clusters. It says, I want to deploy the edge package to all the edge clusters. We deploy these resources to our management cluster, and then the package variant set controller picks those up and uses them to create package variant resources based upon those label selectors. So in our case, for each regional cluster, we get a distribution one. For each edge cluster, we get an edge one. The package variant resource, this manages the cloning of the upstream package to the downstream repository. So the package variant set managed the targeting and said, here are the repositories I'm interested for this particular upstream package. It generated package variant resources to each of which says, so it's like it's denormalizing effectively, right? It's creating a package variant for each selected repository, and all it's doing is saying, okay, the upstream is my upstream for the whole set. The downstream is that repository that I just selected. And so that's all that's in the package variant. It says downstream is the caching DNS distribution. The repo is the Central 1 regional repo. I'm sorry, the upstream is cache and DNS distribution. So this is the same, we're using the same package name. We don't need to change the package name coming from the source repository. The package variant controller, oh, I've got a hand. Yeah, Wim.
Also, the way that the targeting happens is through the repos, right? So it's basically based on the repo labels, I'm assuming, right?
So the package variant set has, I think it's 3 different ways to do targeting. One is you can explicitly list the repos and package name pairs, because you could change the package name when you clone it. So it's a pair of repo and package name. You can use a label selector against the repos. That's what I'm demonstrating here. Or you can actually use an arbitrary object selector. Now that last one was added specifically so that if we want to use something like the Nefio cluster object that we had in the workshop, we can do that. And there's a way to map, there's a way to specify in the targeting criteria how you map that arbitrary object to a cluster name, to a repo name and a package name. So like in the workshop, we have our cluster object has a repo name attribute field. So you would, in your package variant set, you would specify select Nefio clusters with these labels, and then the repo name is from field repo name. The package name is fixed value, or same as your upstream, whatever. Cindy.
Yeah, so I'm kind of getting confused between the package deployment controller, the POC that we have been using, and this new package variant. So if you could summarize the difference, that will help.
Yes, absolutely. So package deployment controller, you gave it a label selector against Nefio clusters, and you gave it an upstream package, and it did 2 things. One, it used that label selector against the list of Nefio clusters to decide which, and then it looked up the repo in the cluster object via the repo name field. That's how it decided which repos to clone the package to. And then the second thing it did was clone the package and perform config injections. So what we did is we wanted that latter part, which is perform the clone and do config injections, to be something that potentially other controllers could reuse. So we split package deployment controller into 2 separate resources to manage those 2 separate things. The first is to manage the targeting. So that's package variant set. And what it does is you give it an upstream and you give it a label selector or a list of repos, and it creates package variant resources. So all it does is maintain a list of package variant resources, a set of package variant resources. There's a separate controller that for each of those package variant resources will take action and actually do the clone, and in the future do the config injections, and we'll see that it doesn't do that yet. So the idea is to take package deployment controller from the workshop, split it into 2 composable pieces, and instead of into one giant piece.
Okay, and this the link that you have, the example. So does it have an example controller for this package variant, which reconciles this object that I see on the screen?
So package variant is so we don't need to write a special controller for that. Package variant is its own controller, and yes, package variant is reconciled by the package variant controller. And what it does is it clones this upstream into this downstream. And then it's got some, with package deployment controller in the workshop was very happy path only, and very much day one only, or day zero only, day one I guess only. This attempts to fix that. So there's some additional things like adoption policy and deletion policy. What do you do with a package if you delete this resource? Do you leave it in the repo or do you remove it? That's what this deletion policy is. What do you do if somebody creates a package variant, you find an existing package that matches your ownership criteria? Do you adopt it or do you leave it under its own management? So those are those adoption policy and deletion policy. But really what package variant does is, given an upstream and a downstream repository, it does a clone. It will eventually do a bunch of injections and other potential mutations. That's what I'd like to do as part of this group. And it manages those over time, so that if a change is made to the, if you change this from in here from V3 to V4, it will automatically propose a new draft that updates the downstream to V4, for example. Or if you're doing a bunch of config injections and one of those upstream resources in the management cluster that you injected actually changes, then we actually need to propose a new draft. So it will do that as well eventually, which package deployment controller does today. So that's kind of the role of this resource. And what if you were to go and look, like when it ran, it created all of these 11 different draft packages. And so these are complete packages, that I mean, all the changes is in this example, all that changes is the namespace. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of. I have better understanding, but I will have to go through this. What you are.
Yeah. So Tal is going to go through these pieces today too, and like I said, I haven't had a preview, but I know he's put quite a bit of effort into running through a bunch of examples himself. So I think that will be super helpful. I know I think you're in India, so maybe watching the recording, but and I think he's going to try and do an India-friendly time too. But
okay.
The idea here, okay. So, but yeah. But speaking in terms of workshop, package variant set are the evolution of package deployment controller into something decomposed a little bit so that pieces can be reused. The idea was that if I were implementing a topology controller, I don't want to have to re-implement all that config injection and mutation stuff. And so I can now use package variant resource to manage all that for me. It also means that we're able to, if we do this right, we're able to simplify the flow. So in the workshop, we had this odd flow. And if you've been in the package specialization thing, we talked about it a little bit. We had this odd flow where we created a resource. We put the 5G core topology resource, we put a bunch of information in it. We fanned out, and then we had a controller running that copied information from that resource into each package, but that information was the same. So with the new package variant, instead, we can have the package variant controller pre-fan out kind of inject that information, and we get rid of one custom controller. That's part of the goal in this. So the reason I'm going through this is one to just train. Yeah, Anne.
Oh, You can finish and then I can ask my
Okay.
question.
So the reason I'm going through this is one, at the stage we're at right now, part of what we need to do is try using the primitives that exist and use that trial process to identify the gaps in those primitives. So I already know, so if we go, I'm gonna stop sharing this and I'll go back to my agenda. If we look at the agenda, I'll do it after Anne's question, I'll show it. Like, I already know a bunch of gaps, but as we do the exercise of actually trying to build a package for UPF deployment, we're going to work with the package specialization team. We're going to work with the workload cluster team. We're going to figure out what that package looks like, and we're going to figure out what problems we have to solve at which stage. And we're going to discover that we would like to solve this problem at this stage. We think that's the right place to do it, but the primitives we have don't support it. And so that's kind of our initial phase, and I'm calling that the requirements discovery phase if you look at the agenda. So Anne.
Actually, this addressed my question. For SMF, what I'm thinking in my head is the package variant would generate an SMF package variant, so to speak, package, right? Is that the right way of thinking or not?
Maybe.
Okay.
So one of the things, like, this is why I think we kind of have to some extent, we have to try it and really identify. The devil's going to be in the details here, in that there are kind of, it's a very wide configuration of a network function. This is configuration of the Kubernetes parts of deploying a network function is actually a really broad surface area. And like, we need to figure out, there's probably 50 problems in there, and maybe we need to solve 3 of them for free 5GC. And we need to figure out what those 3 are and the best way to solve them. So one way to like, if you go back to the presentation Aravind was doing a few weeks ago, we thought about doing exactly what you're saying, where we would use package variant to kind of to inject the cluster invariant stuff, and then use that as the base for the package variant set. So you actually have like a package variant set, and then that created package variants. That's absolutely one way to do it. I'm not sure it's necessary. One of the sort of discussions we had was maybe we instead just rely on humans to do that part for now. And that's where you get a package like this, where we're sort of like, the idea is that the infrastructure team and the network function team come together, and maybe it's multiple infrastructure teams, and they kind of come to an agreement on what the architecture looks like in this organization of this particular network function on this particular infrastructure. And then they capture those decisions in a package, and then we can just fan that out. Rather than trying to capture those decisions in a specialized resource that a controller manipulates in some way, it may be simpler, or maybe it's eventually done by some higher level orchestrator, I don't know. But certainly for R1, it may be simpler to just kind of build a package that contains already the stuff we know pre-deployment.
That point just raised something else in my head, and I'm not trying to be instigator, but it's gonna come across like Helm, right? If the different infrastructure and networking teams come together and put together a package for SMF for a cluster, is that a potential point for supporting of Helm charts? You can yell at me and take it offline.
Yeah, I think that's a bigger like, I would prefer, that's a whole nother discussion of how
okay.
There's like at least 5 or 6 different ways we can integrate with Helm if necessary. And in some sense, if you're talking cross-team things that make sense in the way that, like, let's not dictate to other teams how they have to do their work, but like we would have a way to incorporate it such that it doesn't disrupt the
Yeah.
value proposition. And that it's I know that's a very abstract thing to say, very corporate speak, but like if you dig into the details of some of the links, you'll see some of the ways I'm thinking about it. I think Tal's got ideas as well. Other people have ideas. So, but that's,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think we want to think about it for R1, honestly.
Oh yeah, no, you know me, R1 first. I
Yeah.
just what you just said.
Yeah.
Put that thought in my head. That's all.
Sure,
Thanks.
sure. Yeah. Wim.
Yeah, so I was thinking, John, at the end of the day, I mean, if you look at this in the packet variant, we could actually put all the specialization in there. I mean,
well, the things
it's probably beyond R1. It's beyond R1, but what I'm trying to say is that if you have sufficient logic in the packet variant, you can actually, because you know where to go. And I mean, if you look to my function controller, it would do that.
Right.
You have all the mechanisms to do it.
I think the thing that I think we can't do right up front are the things like you're doing with IPAM, right? So like,
Yes.
like things that depend upon everything. I want to do everything that we do know up front. I want to do at package variant. So like inject the cluster, the cluster context or site information, inject, but at some point you need another controller to come in. There's an interaction between controllers. So like you need to allocate, you need to like you need a place to store.
Even that I covered. Even that I cover, I think. I will talk. We can discuss, but it's not for
Okay.
R1. But we should probably discuss this going forward. Yeah, I think we can do all of this if you want.
But like some of the things that I'm thinking about are like the dependency stuff we talked about earlier, right? Like I want a separate controller that can come in and identify dependencies, and I don't want to tie it to the fan out or package variant directly, because there's also.
I'm with you on that one. I'm with you on that, but yeah. So there is two steps. One is basically fan out, basically. Then you can say specialization or hydration.
I see what you're saying.
Okay, we'll see. And then we can basically say, okay, now we need to deploy, and you have like a deployment type of thingy that does a gradual rollout or stuff like that. So these are in my head 3 different sets. Probably R1 we can probably not. I think probably in the variant you could probably do things to make this work as all function runner type of stuff, even if they call outside. So it's possible to do that.
Yeah, we do. Okay, well let's have that as a separate discussion. Yeah, post R1. I think there are those possibilities, but right now we don't even have function running. So so we'll one step at a time. But I agree, there may be more we can do there. I think there will still be a place for like the package conditions and the post fan out rendering by independent controllers, but there may be more we can do in the pipeline, is what you're saying, I think. Yeah. Okay, so hopefully that was not too confusing. I will try to I'll try and see what Tal covers today, and then I'll try and use that to tailor some bootstrapping type of discussions for next week. I would also love to hear from folks. It's difficult sometimes for me to know, we've got new people coming into the community. We have people who are familiar with the way we did things in the workshop. Like, any guidance for how I can make those bootstrapping sessions most productive for people, I would appreciate. I will come up with something regardless of whether I hear from anybody or not, but I want to make sure we make the best use of everybody's time. So I would prefer to cover things that people have questions about rather than cover things that have been covered in other forums. So anyway, thank you. Excited to get this kicked off. We'll get bootstrapping sessions on the doc, but for the repeating sessions, I'm just going to leave it at this one for now, and we'll make a decision as we move forward whether we need more like triage meetings or things like that. Oh, one other quick logistics things. I know the TSC is starting now. If you did not accept your invitation, then it will expire. So if you are in GitHub and you're in this list, that I see here, it means you have not accepted your invitation. And I don't know how long it is, but after a week or so, maybe it will expire these, and then, you know, I'll have to do it again, which isn't the end of the world, but I'd rather not. So please go into GitHub and accept your invitation. And anyway, we'll see you all later. Thanks.